So now that we finally know what the new main mechanic for Overdress is, now the question arises, what does it mean for Vanguard?
Stand up! Vanguard!
This week we finally got the news and information about what Persona Ride is, the new main mechanic for Overdress. And in this video I want to put that mechanic under a microscope and analyze it to its full capacity to have a better understanding how this works, and more importantly what this could mean for Vanguard in the long run and in the short while probably for Standard, as I don't see this mechanic impact Premium in the near future because of how it is functioning, but you'll understand as we go through this video. Now, of course, before we dive into the whole discussion itself, let's first take a look at the mechanic itself for anybody that for some reason doesn't know what it is, and basically clarify the basic fundamentals. So, everything that you need to know about Persona Ride can be summarized in one image, and that is this image. Basically, how this works is you have a grade 3 with the Persona Ride icon printed on the card. You have them as your Vanguard, and the moment that you write the exact same copy of that unit onto itself, the Persona Ride ability will activate. And that ability basically is you draw a card, and for that turn, all of your front row units get a power plus 10k power buff. Now, the important thing here is that the power buff is continuous, locked to the circles and not the units. So, if you move your units from front row to back row, they lose the power, but if you move back row units to the front row, they gain the power. Same as if you call new units to the circle, they still get the power, because it's basically given to the circles, and then any unit that's on top of that gains the power. Somewhat similar to force markers, but the important thing is that this power increase, aka these pseudo force markers, disappear at the end of the turn. So it's only a temporary power boost. And that is basically all you need to know about the Persona Ride to get an understanding of how this mechanic works and what type of implications this might have for the game. Now let's talk about positives and negatives. And let's start with the negatives here. And the first one that's probably on everybody's mind when they just heard me explain it. This is quite a boring mechanic if we're gonna be very honest. Like, it's just a ride on top of your Vanguard, so a Persona Ride with the same unit, and you just give your front row a passive 10k power buff. Yes, you draw a card, but that's somewhat to mitigate the loss that you just rode in another unit that's exactly the same unit that you have. So if the unit doesn't have an on-place effect or doesn't use Soul for its ability, you just waste the card from your hand, so the draw will make up for it. And somewhat similar to Axel 2, as you draw the card back that you just ridden, so you don't lose card advantage. Now, and as for the 10k power buff, like, we've seen this in V over time and time again, that every unit gives a X amount of power buff to the front row. Like, Gaia does this, Gurgit does this, Luar to some extent does this with all the force markers it generated. Every boss unit at some point during the VR did this, and even some strides from the premium collection gave a X amount of power boost to the front row, like Castile, the Castile stride does it. So it's not something new, it's very bland, it's very boring in the aspect how it functions, but at the same time that doesn't necessarily have to be a negative point, as seen as because of the fact that it is so bland and boring, it also leaves room for a lot of potential innovative skill design. But we get to that later in the video when we go over the positives. Now, another negative point about this mechanic, and it also is very clear cut when you see this, it favors people going first. The player that goes first will have the first grade 3 on the Vanguard circle, but is also the player that will probably can write the same grade 3 first. So the player going first has the higher likely chance of activating this skill earlier than the opponent, thus having an edge on the opponent itself. Now, is this as problematic as most going first mechanics like gift markers? Not necessarily, as there are some issues with this core mechanic, how it functions, but again, we get to that once we go over the other points. But the only thing that you need to keep in mind is that, yes, the opponent might go first, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they meet the requirements to actually activate the Persona Ride before you, even though they went first. Now, as another negative point to this is that there isn't really a counterplay option within the mechanic itself, because as seen as the power is given continuously to the front row and it's not locked to the units being present onto the board, means that even though your opponent might not have any rear guards, they still can gain advantage of the 10k power buff if they just call new units. Meaning the player going second doesn't have the option to maybe not put pressure on the Vanguard and just go for the rear guards. That option isn't there anymore, because the power is going to be on the board no matter what, even if you snipe those rear guards away. If this was locked to the units instead of the circles, then the player going second had some leeway in to alleviate the potential pressure coming from the next turn if your opponent is going to activate the persona right before you can. Sadly, that option is out the window, but at the same time, if this wasn't the case and it was locked to rear guards, then retire clans, aka probably Dragon Empire, maybe to some extent Dark States, will get a complete edge over any nation, because they probably have the best control option and they can just remove any units of the field every single turn, making any other nation that doesn't have control option basically useless, as they can never benefit from the persona right mechanic that way. So I can understand why they went for this route, as it somewhat alleviates the option of control, because in that world, control decks will probably be way stronger than any other deck that doesn't have a control option to their disposal. And those are the main negative points that are discussed and probably very, very out there. But there are of course a lot of positives, and some of these positives comes directly out of some of these negatives, because even though it favors your opponent going first, this does slow the game down quite a bit from gift markers, just by the sheer fact that this mechanic activates the earliest on turn 4 instead of turn 3 for your regular gift markers, as same as with strides. Strides are somewhat more of a turn 3.5, because it's the opponent that goes to the grade 3, so the player going second instead of the player going first to turn 4, so it's in between that, but still this mechanic is even slower than that, which is really good because it gives players at least more turns to prepare or do their stuff, and it makes the games also feel less bad when they suddenly end while you're still at grade 2. That will never happen here, because just by pure of the mechanic itself, you should be able to get at least to grade 3, and in the first couple of sets, probably the first persona right won't kill you, so you can probably go to turn 5 or 6 even. So this mechanic does slow the game down just by how it works. Of course, if we ever get other kinds of superior right shenanigans and anything, then yeah, this could go a bit faster, but just by the sheer basics of it, it is much slower than markers. Now, another positive point about this mechanic, and this also comes down to the whole favors going first might not always be the case, is that this mechanic by default is less consistent than any type of mechanic we had before. Because we need specifically the exact same unit onto the Vanguard circle by riding it to activate this effect, means that even though you might be on grade 3 first, it doesn't guarantee the fact that you have another copy in your hand to actually write the same card next turn to activate the persona right. Thus, nullifying going first to some extent if you don't have a good consistency engine. Now granted, we have the right deck, which helps this to some extent, because you can always write a grade 3 from your right deck and then hopefully get another copy from your hand to then write into that same unit the following turn, thus increasing the consistency a little bit on regards premium and V premium that need to rely on drawing 2 copies very early on to even secure this mechanic. So that alleviates the potential problem if this mechanic becomes stronger and stronger, that at the very least, as long as we don't have good consistency searchers or consistency engines, then there is always that potential that your opponent might not even have access to this ability or to this mechanic, which is fine if I'm going to be very honest in that regard. Now, to put another thing on top of that, what's pretty good about this mechanic is that the power boost is a temporary power boost, meaning it doesn't stack throughout the game, so it doesn't accelerate into crazy numbers or tempo plays what we've seen with gift markers. Excel, Protect, and Force, no matter if you use type 1 or type 2, they accumulate value onto the board and they can stack up value, which means at some point you get a critical mass of this stuff and you will win games. And as soon as they stay on the board, means that going to your grade 3 first and just spamming them out actually is beneficial to the player who couldn't do that the fastest and the earliest. Now, with the persona ride mechanic, that whole aspect is out the window. Yes, you might be able to, maybe in the future, be able to superior ride into your grade 3 maybe multiple times, so you can stack multiple persona rides in a single turn. But if you do not kill your opponent, even though you just generated 40k to the board, if you don't kill them, you lose all of that advantage after your turn ends. It's not like a force marker that stays on the board so you can keep getting value even the turn after that. In this case, you lose the power and you need to begin next turn again building up your resources or your persona right effects or whatever you're trying to do, meaning games are going to be way more strategic because you need to be aware when you need to activate the persona right ability and when to not activate the ability, because they matter now as they are temporary power boosts. And that basically rounds up the positive and negative. So for the last part of this video, I want to have a little bit of discussion on how I think about this mechanic and what I personally feel about this and how this could impact the game in general. And honestly, most of my points already told them a little bit into the positives and negative points, because I feel that this mechanic is quite bland and somewhat unoriginal to some extent, as it feels like a break right-ish or cross right-ish mechanic, but then put on steroids because you give your entire front with 10k power. And I find it kind of annoying to the extent that the power is passively, so it could be abusable in the future if you get these swappers like we see in Aquaforce. If we get a lot of these attackers, all gaining the power can be quite detrimental in some cases, but it depends how they want to implement this. But then again, as I stated, this is not a consistent engine because you need 2 specific cards to even activate this in the first place, which means there will always be that situation in the game where you think, does my opponent have the persona right or doesn't he have the persona right? And you try to play around those specific interactions and situations, and the player that can maneuver the best around this will come out of top of this game, which makes it also a pretty interesting mechanic in the fact that, yes, it favors going first, but because it's an inconsistent engine or a mechanic, means that it's not like Strides, or in Strides maybe favors players going second, but it definitely isn't like gift markers where the value and power is guaranteed. Like if you went up against a Gurgit player or Luard player and they went first, you know you're in a tough ride, or whatever the saying is, because they're gonna get a lot of those markers and you still are grade 2 and you need to then fight up against that uphill battle through all the value they accumulated. In this case, even if you went second, your opponent isn't sure that they might get that value engine going, so you might actually have time to prepare. And even then, if they get this whole thing off fast, you still have that one extra turn, unlike the V-Series, where you can at least go to grade 3, get your twin drive, get some of your valuable skills, and build up a wall once your opponent maybe activate the persona right. And that is where we get in probably the most interesting part about this mechanic. It is the persona right activation. Because this effect is temporarily, as I explained in the positive point, it creates this song and dance from players, like where they try to maneuver around each other to get that perfect window of opportunity to activate the persona right. As you can activate this willy-nilly, but that might not always be the optimal play, because if you write your grade 3, that means you only have 3 copies of that unit left in your deck. So if you go to your second grade 3 turn, you immediately write that copy and you get this 10k power and you get this draw of, then yes, that can be fine. But if you didn't kill your opponent or you didn't pressure them enough that you probably will win the next turn, and you don't have another copy of that unit, which is very unlikely as you then only have 2 other cards left in your deck, you probably are going to lose, or you're on the back foot for the rest of the match, because you just wasted your potential power play by doing absolutely nothing. Because using the persona right mechanic, while your opponent is maybe at 2 or 3 damage, doesn't really equate too much depending on how your deck functions. Because yes, that extra 10k power is nice, but if it's just 1 damage, your opponent can take maybe 1 or 2, and you didn't even put enough value or damage dent into the shield value, and maybe they get an heal or defensive trigger, and that basically screwed up your play for that turn. And this then translates in that whole dance that you have between players, where they try to maneuver the situation to a particular instance where going in for that persona right actually will help them secure the game. Maybe that particular turn, or then for the following turn after, where your opponent couldn't stabilize on the board or their hand, and they just die the following turn. And for anybody that thinks that they could potentially power creep this mechanic with something like an Ezel Superior Right Chain, where they can write multiple copies of the same unit to stack persona rights, yes, that can be a situation, but that will still follow in the same dense situation that I just explained, because yes, you can get maybe 3 or 4 Persona right now. You cannot get 4, but maybe 3 Persona rights stacked on top of each other. That will be nice, but effectively that's just 30k power to your units. And 30k power to your units, if you only have 3 attacks, we have seen way more in the V series with just force marker stacking, or just force decks that can just pump up power on the units way higher. And they cannot always kill on a turn, because if they lack crits or whatever, that means then nothing. And if you just wasted that for a turn where you didn't kill your opponent, you probably have no more Persona rights for the rest of the game. Meaning you just wasted your strongest push turn, and your opponent is still alive and probably have enough shield value and cards to then push against you. So I feel that this Persona right mechanic is less abusable than something like gift markers, by the sheer mechanic how it works, that you need specifically 2 copies of the same unit, the power is temporarily, and your opponent basically has way to prepare for it, as it's fastest a turn 4 mechanic right now, and even if it's a turn 3 mechanic in the future, it still isn't as fast as gift markers, because gift markers started as a turn 3 mechanic, and they slowly turned into a turn 2 mechanic with superior right engines and all that kind of stuff that we see right now. So as far as this mechanic goes, yes, it's kind of bland how it works, but the way how they implemented this in a game, it opens up this interesting dynamic between players where they try to navigate the game into the right scenario where they can win the game with this mechanic, but the mechanic itself doesn't necessarily dictate the game as you always win by this mechanic. It is basically a tool that players can utilize to potentially win games, because this on surface actually feels more like a potential extra skill a card could have than actually something that dictates the power cards themselves, like gift markers. Like in the V series, you probably will never pick a grade 3 without a gift marker, because the gift marker is that more impactful than whatever skill might print it on the card. In this case, yes, this 10k power and this draw could be nice on the front row, but at the same time, this is a very inconsistent mechanic. We could easily just choose to go for a grade 3 that has a really good solid skill without the Persona Ride mechanic, because we at least know that this skill will 100% activate every single turn, because we can put the grade 3 in our ride deck and we are done. We aren't reliant on getting another copy in our hand, and we don't have to wiggle around the situation where we potentially could get this extra 10k power to 3 units, because that's basically what it is. 10k power to 3 units, and that grade 3 in your hand will become another card, because that's the card that you draw. Yes, you generate this soul, but if your deck doesn't utilize soul, that's it. So that is, I think, the most important positive side about this mechanic. Because so far, depending on how they're gonna make skills and design the cards, this could actually be an extra tool to our disposal to design or create decks without actually that mechanic dictating our strategies or our decks, like we've seen with gift markers ever since the V series starts. Now, I could be completely wrong, and Persona Ride might actually be the way to go, and every single deck needs to uphold to Persona Ride as it is. But honestly, it doesn't really feel that way, because it is a temporary power boost, and it's also relatively slow and inconsistent, unlike what we've seen with gift markers, which is permanent and instantaneously. So those are big differences. And that's also the reason why I don't think that this mechanic will impact premium for a long while. Like, this feels way too slow, and also the 10k power buff and draw, like, premium can do way better than that, way easier, way faster. So yeah, this looks actually pretty decent, because as I said, this opens up different deck designs and different deck buildings. As I remember when V started, that there were a lot of friends of mine and people within my community that hoped that once we get these gift markers and we see these cards, that we can build decks with gift markers and without gift markers, and they're on the same power level, because the gift markers that won't overpower or dictate our deck building choices. Well, right from set 1, that was disproven, because gift markers were immediately the way to go, because it was way too strong and it overpowered anything that didn't have a gift marker. But it might actually be the case here with Persona Ride. This could be the perfect mechanic that splits this in half, and we have actually 2 potential uses and 2 different deck build strategy routes that we can take. But that's basically everything that I wanted to discuss about the Persona Ride mechanic itself. Like, basically, to summarize it in maybe 1 or 2 sentences, yes, the mechanic is very bland and very boring in the surface level, but once you dissect everything, I think this is a very nice addition to Vanguard that not only could potentially revolutionize deck building yet again, on top of the whole ride deck thing that I talked about last week, but it might also change the game matches itself, because it's a slower and more inconsistent mechanic that could win you games, but feels more like an extra tool to our arsenal than yet something that dictates our game plan. Which is honestly pretty good, because the last time that was the case was with strides. And strides are kind of a mixed mesh here, because yes, they are more like tools that can give us options to do something, but at the same time, at the end, they dictated our game plan, because all we did were strides, and they were finishers and all that kind of stuff, but they were more like a toolbox, because we could go in any strides that we want, if you catch my drift here. So I get really good feelings about this mechanic, but of course we have 0 skills to go through, and this is just pure speculation on the bland surface of just how this mechanic functions. But if we compare this with what we have in the past, I'm very positive about what this could bring to standard. And that basically summarizes everything I want to discuss in this video. Again, if you have anything that you want to discuss about this topic, or anything that you want to say about the Persona Ride, or what you hope for will come to this mechanic, or how it might implement with certain cards, let me know all your thoughts in the comment section down below. As always, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters over at patreon.com/VanguardInsider. You guys are amazing. If you want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Time Leaf, and I see you guys in the next one.